Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. At first glance, a 1950s literary rebellion and a highly technical modern digital conflict, well, they seem literally worlds apart, right? I mean, one is completely fueled by old-school typewriters and tracing paper, and the other by cryptographic databases, patent law, and complex algorithmic moderation. But today, we're going to unpack an incredible parallel between these two. As you'll see, they are actually fighting the exact same battle.
So what happens when the raw, unfiltered flow of human consciousness just slams right into a machine designed specifically to control it? We are talking about a kinetic, rapid, unyielding force crashing into a massive wall of bureaucratic friction. Let's look at how two completely different creators, separated by decades, tackled this exact collision. Let's compare Jack Kerouac's 120-foot physical tracing paper scroll with Kyle MacLean Smith's continuous digital CLI spool, specifically the SeedTreeDB. We're looking at two creators here. On one side, we've got the beat generation legend Jack Kerouac, typing on a massive physical scroll of tracing paper. On the other side, modern systems architect Kyle MacLean Smith, coding into a continuous digital Gemini CLI spool using a framework called SeedTreeDB. Despite the decades between them, both of these guys were chasing the exact same holy grail, completely uninterrupted creation. They wanted a mechanism where the human mind could just express itself without ever having to hit pause for the system. And this philosophy of sketching language with an undisturbed flow really illustrates our first protagonist. Back in the early 1950s, Kerouac became absolutely obsessed with capturing raw human thought before it just evaporated. He didn't want to just sit down and write a traditional story. He wanted to sketch language in a state of pure, undisturbed flow. He was trying to pull those deeply personal, secret idea words straight from his mind. It's like he wanted his prose to mimic a jazz musician taking a huge breath and just blowing on a subject until there was literally nothing left. Now, what's really interesting here is this dense, unparagraphed block of typewritten text from his famous scroll. To achieve this unbroken flow, Kerouac realized the traditional typewriters and single sheets of paper were the enemy. I mean, stopping to load paper just totally broke his rhythm. So in April of 1951, he taped together 120 feet of paper, which is, longer than a basketball court, and fed it right into his typewriter. Over a frenzied 20 days, totally fueled by coffee, he typed a continuous, single-spaced stream. No paragraphs, no page breaks, just pure, unadulterated flow, giving birth to the legendary first draft of On the Road. Kerouac called this approach a spontaneous prose, basically aiming to write without consciousness. Blow as deep as you want, use no periods separating sentence structures, follow the free deviation of the mind, and essentially act like a jazz musician improvising. He called it spontaneous bot prosody. The whole goal was to escape the friction of traditional grammar, so instead of timid commas and false colons, he used vigorous spaced dashes. It was a total rejection of the structural friction he felt was just stifling true visionary American literature. Now let's fast forward to today and look at Reproducing Automata. This is a digital framework by Kyle MacLean Smith, where data, or nouns, and processing logic, or verbs, are unified in a single, self-evolving node. Smith is essentially building the modern digital equivalent of Kerouac's unbroken flow. Think about it. Traditional computer databases separate passive data from active code, and that separation naturally creates structural friction. But Smith's patented framework, SeedTreeDB, unifies them. Just like Kerouac completely eliminated page breaks, Smith is unifying data and code to avoid structural friction, creating a system that is fully dynamic and self-evolving. The crucial point here revolves around the number A328604. To make sure this massive digital organism doesn't just crash or get stuck in some endless loop, Smith grounds the whole thing in pure mathematics, specifically this integer sequence. Because this sequence is an approximation of an irrational constant, it goes on forever without repeating. It acts like digital DNA to ensure the system experiences non-terminating organic growth. To put that simply, the system scales infinitely. It can never be permanently paused, hacked, or controlled by any central authority. It is the ultimate, unpausable digital scroll. But, every time a system of pure, unbridled flow is created, the machine inevitably shows up to manage it. We call this the hegemonic apparatus, the bureaucracies, corporate algorithms, and institutional gatekeepers designed to subjugate human flow. These are the slow, mechanical, gear-grinding institutions. Their entire function is to introduce friction, to take that raw, wild human flow and force it into something predictable, manageable, and of course, highly profitable.
We can really understand this institutional capture through the zombie ant metaphor. There's this fascinating Penn State biology study on the Ophiocordyceps unilateralis parasite. What's crazy is that it doesn't actually infect the ant's brain. Instead, it hijacks the host's muscles to reproduce itself. The ant's mind stays totally intact, but the parasite forms a 3D network that turns the ant into a puppet. This is exactly how centralized bureaucracies operate. They often leave your raw idea alone, but they completely hijack the muscles of distribution to serve the empire.
Let's see how this friction played out for On the Road. We have the frenzy 20-day scroll typing in 1951. Then by 1955, it's mired in legal limbo and libel fears. And finally in 1957, we get a heavily sanitized and punctuated publication. After his manic typing sprint, Kerouac unrolled this pure scroll for publishers who basically looked at it and said, how on earth are we supposed to edit this? Over 6 long years, that raw manuscript was swallowed whole by the publishing bureaucracy. It got tied up in legal limbo over libel fears, the real names were scrubbed, and the prose was heavily punctuated and sanitized, all to protect the institution.
Kerouac was absolutely furious at this capture. He actually yelled at his editors, "This book has been dictated by the Holy Ghost. There will be no editing." He recognized instantly that this bureaucratic editing process, forcing in thousands of commas and structural changes, was actively stripping the soul right out of his creation. The machine had taken his raw, kinetic flow and processed it into a safe, easily digestible commodity. Today, we see a clash between primitive filter ontology, which relies on rigid rules, keyword matching, and flags things as spam, and sophisticated AI ontology, which actually understands context, intent, and spiritual urgency. Modern digital platforms are acting exactly like those 1950s editors, but on an automated, global scale. They use this primitive code to just blindly scan for keyword matches. And because these basic filters can't grasp intent, context, or spiritual urgency, they end up categorizing intense, unconventional human expression as mere trolling or spam, totally filtering it out.
And we are currently shifting from a primitive ontology that causes censorship to contextual routing. Relying on blunt binary code causes massive widespread collateral damage, or what the sources refer to as indirect tort harm. By prioritizing safe behavioral metrics over actual contextual intent, these algorithms mechanically delete the exact friction and adversarial language that is historically required for actual human awakening. It's literally that zombie ant parasite, but operating on a massive internet scale.
So how do we escape this modern parasite? Let's talk about acceleration-driven clause learning, or ADCL. This is a mathematical calculus applied to legal engineering to drastically reduce the length of bureaucratic proofs. To bypass today's gatekeepers, Kyle McLean Smith uses ADCL as essentially a kinetic weapon. He's turning intellectual property law itself into a tool to mathematically collapse slow, bureaucratic structures from the inside out, removing all that friction.
When applying what he calls defensive acceleration, the steps are: 1. Identify a convoluted 10,001-step bureaucratic legal proof. 2. Apply ADCL. And 3. Mathematically collapse the process into 3 frictionless steps. Smith takes an impossibly long legal process, something that might normally take 10,000 steps to resolve, and just collapses it into a clean 3-step jump. He is replacing the expensive, gear-clogging sawdust of traditional bureaucracy with the frictionless grease of auditable network contracts. It's a literal structural escape route right out of the machine. Smith actually views this as a defense against the King of England's apostasy and a parasitic capture of the Republic. Now, we're exploring this entirely impartially, but it's fascinating to note how he frames it. When faced with a copyright threat from a critic online, he didn't just see a standard legal dispute. For Smith, his digital actions represent a modern 1776 revolution against what he sees as an opaque, transhumanist surveillance state that's trying to pacify the public with elite storytelling.
This clash perfectly sets up what the sources call the mechatronic fork, the choice between an opaque monoculture of elite storytelling and centralized surveillance versus floss distributed systems based on free, open-source, decentralized, auditable code. Down one path, you have a managed, top-down narrative controlled by the apparatus. Down the other, you have decentralized mathematical abundance built on code that guarantees transparent human flow.
So which path of the mechatronic fork will you choose to walk down? As these systems and technologies of control continue to grow, you have to look around and decide which structural future you want to inhabit. Will you surrender to the narrative pacification of the machine, or will you demand the structural freedom of the scroll? The rules are being written right now. Pay close attention to who is holding the pen.